The revival process of the Hebrew language took place in Europe and Palestine towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, through which the language's usage changed from the sacred language of Judaism to a spoken and written language used for daily life in Israel. The process began as Jews started arriving in Palestine in the first half of the 19th century and used Hebrew as a lingua franca. However, a parallel development in Europe changed Hebrew from primarily a sacred liturgical language into a literary language, which played a key role in the development of nationalist educational programs. Modern Hebrew, along with modern Arabic, has been an official language in Israel since the British Mandate of Palestine, a situation that continued after the Israeli Declaration of Independence in 1948. More than purely a linguistic process, the revival of Hebrew was utilized by Jewish modernization and political movements, and became a tenet of the ideology associated with settlement of the land, Zionism and Israeli policy. The process of Hebrew's return to regular usage is unique. There are no other examples of a natural language without any native speakers subsequently acquiring several million such native speakers, and no other examples of a sacred language becoming a national language with millions of first-language speakers. The language's revival eventually brought linguistic additions with it, while the initial leaders of the process insisted they were only continuing from the place where Hebrew's vitality was ended. What was created represented a broader basis of language acceptance. It includes characteristics derived from all periods of Hebrew language, as well as from the non-Hebrew languages used by the long-established European, North African, and Middle Eastern Jewish communities, with Yiddish being predominant. Background: the existence of Hebrew is attested from the 10th century BCE to the late Second Temple period, after which the language developed into Mishnah Hebrew. From the 2nd century CE until the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language circa 1880, Hebrew was employed as a literary and official language and the language of prayer. Ever since the spoken usage of Mishnah Hebrew ended in the 2nd century CE, Hebrew had not been spoken as a mother tongue. Even so, during the Middle Ages, the language was used by Jews in a wide variety of disciplines. This usage kept alive a substantial portion of the traits characteristic of Hebrew. First and foremost, classical Hebrew was preserved in full through well-recognized sources, chiefly the Tanakh and the Mishnah. Apart from these, Hebrew was known through hymns, prayers, midrashim, and the like. During the Middle Ages, Hebrew was used as a written language in rabbinical literature, including in judgments of halakha, responsa, and books of meditation. In most cases, certainly in the base of Hebrew's revival, 18th and 19th century Europe, the use of Hebrew was not at all natural, but heavy and flowery language in quotations, non-grammatical forms, and mixing in of other languages, especially Aramaic. Hebrew was used not only in written form but also as an articulated language, in synagogues and in Beit Midrash. Thus, Hebrew phonology and the pronunciation of vowels and consonants were preserved. Despite this, in the region the influence of foreign tongues caused many changes, leading to the development of different forms of pronunciation. Ashkenazi Hebrew, used by Eastern and Western European Jews, which maintained mostly the structure of vowels but may have moved the stress and lost the gemination, although this cannot be known for sure, as there are no recordings of how the language sounded. E.g., in Canon, Ashkenazi Hebrew pronunciation has a variation of vowels and consonants, which follows closely the variation of the vowel and consonant signs written down by the Masortes around the 7th century CE, indicating that there is a strong link with the language heard by them. E.g., where we see two different vowel signs, or a consonant with respect, without a dagesh, a difference is also heard in the various Ashkenazic pronunciations. Sephardi Hebrew, used by Sephardi Jews, preserved a structure different from the recognized Tiberians Hebrew Nikud of only 5 vowels. but did preserve the consonants, the grammatical stress, the dagesh, and the schwa, yet different ways of writing consonants are not always heard in all Sephardic pronunciations. E.g., the Dutch Sephardic pronunciation does not make a difference between the beth with and without dagesh. Both are pronounced as b. The taf is always pronounced as t, with or without dagesh. There are two possibilities. The difference disappeared over time in the Sephardic pronunciations, or it never was there in the first place. The pronunciation stems from a separate Hebrew dialect, which always was there, and which e.g., the Masortes did not use as reference. Yemenite Hebrew, which thought by some to preserve much of the classical Hebrew pronunciation, was barely known when the revival took place. Within each of these groups, there also existed different subsets of pronunciation. For example, differences existed between the Hebrew used by Polish Jewry and that of Lithuanian Jewry and of German Jewry. In the 50 years preceding the start of the revival process, a version of spoken Hebrew already existed in the markets of Jerusalem. The Sephardic Jews who spoke Ladino or Arabic and the Ashkenazi Jews who spoke Yiddish needed a common language for commercial purposes. The most obvious choice was Hebrew. Although Hebrew was spoken in this case, it was not a native mother tongue, but a more of a pidgin. The linguistic situation against which the background the revival process occurred was one of diglossia. When two languages, one of prestige and class and another of the masses, exist within one culture. In Europe, this phenomenon has waned, starting with English in the 16th century. But there were still differences between spoken street language and written language. For example, Russians spoke popular Russian to each other, but wrote in a more literary style of Russian or French, while Germans spoke in local dialects and wrote in Standard German. Likewise, Arabs spoke locally specific forms of colloquial Arabic, but writing was done in Standard Arabic. In Europe, the situation mirrored that of the general population, but with Yiddish as the spoken language, the language of the broader culture used for secular speech and writing, and Hebrew for liturgical purposes. In the Arab Middle East, Ladino and colloquial Arabic were the spoken languages most prevalent in Jewish communities, while classical Arabic was used for secular writing, and Hebrew used for religious purposes. Revival of literary Hebrew. The revival of the Hebrew language in practice advanced in two parallel strains: the revival of written literary Hebrew and the revival of spoken Hebrew. In the first few decades, the two processes were not connected to one another and even occurred in different places. Literary Hebrew was renewed in Europe's cities, whereas spoken Hebrew developed mainly in Palestine. The two movements began to merge only in the beginning of the 1900s, and an important point in this process was the immigration of Chaim Nahman Bialik to Palestine in 1924. But after the transfer of literary Hebrew to Palestine, a substantial difference between spoken and written Hebrew remained, and this difference persists today. The characteristics of spoken Hebrew only began to seep into literature in the 1940s. And only in the 1990s did spoken Hebrew widely appear in novels. Hebrew during the Haskalah 8 preceding process to the revival of literary Hebrew took place during the Haskalah, the Jewish movement paralleling the secular Enlightenment. Members of this movement, called Maskilim, who sought to distance themselves from rabbinic Judaism, decided that Hebrew, specifically Biblical Hebrew, was deserving of fine literature. They considered Mishnah Hebrew and other varieties of Hebrew to be defective and unfit for writing. The Haskalah-era literature written in Hebrew based itself upon two central principles: purism and flowery language. Purism was a principle which dictated that all words used should be of biblical origin. The principle of flowery language was based on bringing full verses and expressions as they were from the Tanakh, and the more flowery a verse was, the more quality it was said to possess. Another linguistic trait thought to increase a text's prestige was the use of hapax legomena, words appearing only once in the text, But while it was easy to write stories taking place in the biblical period and dealing with biblical topics, Haskalah-era writers began to find it more and more difficult to write about contemporary topics. This was due mostly to the lack of a broad and modern vocabulary, meaning translating books about science and mathematics or European literature was difficult. This barrier was finally breached in the 1880s by a writer named Mendel Mendel, whose given name was Yurakov Abramovich but is often known by the name of his main character, Mendel meaning bookseller. He began writing in Hebrew as a Haskalah writer and wrote according to all the conventions of Haskalah-era literature. At a certain point, he decided to write in Yiddish and caused a linguistic revolution, which was expressed in the widespread usage of Yiddish in Hebrew literature. After a long break he returned in 1886 to writing in Hebrew, but decided to ignore the rules of biblical Hebrew, and proponents of that style, like Abraham Mipu, and added into the vocabulary a host of words from the Rabbinic Age and the Middle Ages. His new fluid and varied style of Hebrew writing reflected the Yiddish spoken around him, while still retaining all the historical strata of Hebrew. For the purposes of his Hebrew works, some of which were translations of his Yiddish books, Mendel needed a language to represent the vernacular language, which contained linguistic jokes and detailed descriptions. He satisfied this need by discarding the restrictions of the Haskalah's biblical flowery language and using figures of speech and vocabulary from the rabbinic literature while incorporating characteristics of spoken syntax found in European languages. Mendel's language was considered a synthetic one, as it consisted of different echelons of Hebrew development and was not a direct continuation of a particular echelon. However, today, his language is often considered a continuation of Rabbinic Hebrew, especially grammatically. See also Robert Alter, and his book The Invention of Hebrew Prose, who has done significant work on modern Hebrew literature and the context which enabled the language to revive itself via creative writing. The book has a large section on Abramovich. ILS. Feldman also gives a short overview of Mendel and his milieu in her book Modernism and Cultural Transfer. She notes the influence of Yiddish on his Hebrew, and traces this language interaction to Gabriel Priel, the last Hebrew poet of America. Eventually, writers like Joseph Haim Brenner would break from Mendel's style, and utilize more experimental techniques. Continuation of the literary revival. Mendel's style was excitedly adopted by contemporary writers and spread quickly. It was also expanded into additional fields. Ahad Ham wrote a superb article in 1889 using the style entitled "This Is Not the Way," and Haim Nahman Bialik expanded it into poetry with his poem, "To the Bird," of the same year. Additionally, great efforts were taken to write scientific books in Hebrew, for which the vocabulary of scientific and technical terms was greatly increased. At the same time, Europe saw the rise of Hebrew language newspapers and magazines, while even sessions and discussions of Zionist groups were conducted and transcribed in Hebrew. In addition, poets and writers such as David Friskman and Charles Chiniszowski began avidly translating European works into Hebrew. From the Finnish epic the Kalevala to works by Molière, Goethe, Shakespeare, Homer, Byron, Lermontov, and Aeschylus. At the same time, writers like Micah Yosef Berdichevsky and Uri Nisanganessin began to write complex works of short fiction and novels in Hebrew, using the language to express psychological realism and interiority for the first time. As Hebrew poets and writers began arriving in Palestine armed with the new literary language, they exerted a certain amount of influence on the development of spoken Hebrew as well.